group talked about the application of new historicism in a couple of different texts that we each researched. And so before we begin with our research, we're going to start to talk about the definition of new historicism. And so what we kind of had in combination with the other group is that new historicism is the idea that a text seeks to reconnect with a time period that it was written in, and specifically the cultural and political movements of that time period. So when you look at each of these three texts that we talked about, the Lord of the Flies, The Great Gatsby, and Catcher in the Rye, they have obviously different cultural and political movements of their respective times. And so it's the idea of how this work reconnects with these ideas is what new historicism really means. And so let's start with kind of an open discussion when you guys can take over. But what about your text and the characteristics of your text speaks to new historicism?
All right.
I'll go first.
Yeah.
Do you want to go?
Yeah, I'll go.
Okay.
I also think, Dan, what you were going to say, I also think new historicism also relates to like a religion or ideology, as we have on here. But basically what I talked about was Lord of the Flies. Basically the time period is around like the beginning of the Cold War and the end of World War II. And some things that I came up with were just like, obviously you have people like are inherently savage, like Ralph and his group are just like ruthless and stuff. And then Jack is also like, him and his group are like hunters and killers. And they basically kill a lot of people in the, like on the island who they're with. And I think that kind of relates to like, people are savage relating to like, basically the US and the USSR were going to like drop a nuclear bomb at any time. And you could like, you never really knew like when it was going to happen. And I think that also kind of relates into my next point where like people are kind of like, there's a constant threat of paranoia. Like people didn't know like what was going to happen next. Like in the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was like a few hours when like, you know, it could have went really like downhill from there. But honestly, it turned out well in the end.
Yeah. So in terms of the text that I looked at, which was The Great Gatsby, so that takes place in 1922, right during the Roaring Twenties, which was an extremely influential time period in American history. And I actually found a little pamphlet that the president at the time, Herbert Hoover, wrote called American Individualism. And in this, he basically explained how America has a social system unlike almost anywhere. That's based more upon individualism, which is unlike like the old world, like European societies. And he said that that those like European societies are like constantly like disrupted by war and revolution. And this kind of relates to Great Gatsby. You see how Jay is like he really has like a sense of like individualism and nonconformity. Like he started from the bottom, he worked his way up. He was a fighter in World War I. And he basically built his wealth. And like obviously like it wasn't in like a clean way. Like he had like affiliations with like gang violences and like speakeasies and stuff like that. But that was just part of the time period. And you see like his affiliation with like the corruption. Obviously like with prohibition, like alcohol is banned during the Roaring Twenties. But you still had like bootleggers and speakeasies that like were going against that. And so that just kind of shows how like Gatsby was like an individual and like he didn't like conform to society.
And finally, kind of talking about Catcher in the Rye, I think Rory brought up a great point earlier when he mentioned the time period when there was a great uncertainty about the future. And so in the 1940s, you see a similar sense of uncertainty, but having a different effect on the public, where individuals seem to be much more free with their actions, and they don't have as strong of a tie to their morals as previous generations did. Obviously, the late 1940s, following the end of World War II, is a time of great change for the United States and throughout the world, similar to that of 1920s in the United States, where you have the Roaring Twenties and all the changes during this time period. I mean, Ben brought up Great Gatsby, similar ties there. But in the late 1940s, you see a change in wealth and what wealth means for individuals. Before this time period, wealth had a lot to do with respect, but afterwards it seems like wealth becomes this thing that you just work as hard as you have to work, and it's much more about making the money than it is the process getting there. And so, I mean, Holden talks about this. How would you know if you did it because you really wanted to save guys' lives, or you did it because you really wanted to be a terrific lawyer with everybody slapping you on the back and congratulating you? There's a quote from Catcher in the Rye where Holden really exposes this drastic change in how people view wealth. Another topic and change in culture in the 1940s is how the public views sex, and obviously different than before the late 40s. Sex is much more prominent. It's people are much more open about it, and that becomes kind of a key aspect of society, much more prevalent in society. And the idea of flappers in the 1920s kind of comes along with the idea of prostitutes towards the late 1940s and into the 50s as well. And Holden, obviously, in the text, gets with a prostitute himself. And as a younger kid, really a kid in New York City, it's interesting to see that as of now, in our time period, this seems almost impossible and doesn't seem right. But when you look at it through the lens of New Historicism and applying it to the time period that the book was written in, it really fits the book. And kind of tying into all three, maybe you guys can touch about this a little bit, but there's also, you can see literary moves in similar books and similar time periods. And so, especially in Catcher in the Rye, you see this coming of age novel where there are other books of the time period. The Outsiders is a great example of coming of age novel. And so each time period that these books are kind of from, there's some commonalities between the books that are written, and the three that we have kind of start these changes in literature and how authors write books. So if you want to talk a little about literature and commonalities.
So I think how you're talking about like how like people were inferior. I think in my book, Lord of the Flies, Littlins kind of is the same thing, because I feel like they were like the workers in Lord of the Flies, and that relates to the soldiers at war. And then also how I feel Lord of the Flies goes, and maybe in your books, is like there's two different types of like the people kind of represent like a different side of the war. So in my opinion, like Ralph, or like in the book, Ralph kind of represented like the democracy and like, you know, the conch and how like everything was set up like civilized and stuff. And that was kind of more of the American side. And then Ralph was more of like, or not Ralph, sorry, Jack was more of like a complete leader. He was a hunter, and it kind of like demoralizes the USSR, but like obviously it kind of relates to communism and how like everything was like the same. But Ben, I was kind of interested in what you said and how like the time period affects like how people is like the process of getting there. I was just wondering, I don't want to like put like the spotlight like right on you, but like, do you think that like corruption in like Great Gatsby is like one of the reasons why Jay like gets to the top? Like, do you think he could have found another way to the top other than like gang violence?
I mean, I think like under the lens of New Historicism, you have to look at the time period, and you know, like he was just coming right out of like World War One. Stop laughing already. So like he was just coming out of war, and obviously, like he had met Daisy, and had fallen in love with her, and like coming out of the war, like he like obviously like knew that Tom and her had married. Dan, now you're laughing too. Come on now. And so he was wrapped up in this like almost lust for her, like not even love at that point. Like he was just obsessed with her, and he would go to almost any extent to eventually be with her. Like he worked his way up through corruption. To answer your question, Rory, I'm not sure if he could have gotten that much wealth any other way during that time period. That was just like normal for people, I feel like, during like the Roaring 20s. But he like worked his way to the top. He bought that huge mansion on Long Island, just so he could live right across from Daisy and like stare at that like green light. Like I know like English teachers always like rave about like the green light and like what it symbolizes. But it kind of symbolizes like his like hope for a future with Daisy, because like every night like he'll stare out at it and he knows that like Daisy's right there, and like that future that he wants with her is right there. So I guess this like also kind of shows the hardships that war veterans had to face coming home. Um, Obviously like it was hard for him because he didn't have like a family to come home to. And like when he went off to war, he left the love of his life behind, and like didn't know what the future would hold for him when he got back. But I think it just kind of shows how like certain people have to change like the way they act, to like not conform, but to like be more successful in the time period that they're living in.
Mm-hmm. All right.
And Rory, one more last point when you talked about the connections to the book and what's happening in real life. I think Holden's a great example of an individual who there were more and more Holden Caulfields out in the world in the late 1940s and 50s than there were prior to that time period. An individual, younger kid, school dropout, takes a train into a big city, and obviously, you know a lot of the rest of the story. But the message really is that Holden, as a young kid, can make it on his own, and he's independent enough. And you see throughout the book his thoughts obviously change on individuals. He's pretty cynical throughout the entirety of the book, but he really is an individual in a city, a young individual in a city. And again, looking at today, if you look at it without addressing the new historicism lens, it seems really rare, and it seems dangerous in a sense. Why would a 16-year-old be out in the city on his own and doing the things he's doing? It seems ridiculous. But a lot of these people were rising up in the late 1940s and into the 50s, and this idea of individualism and doing kind of whatever you want to do. Like I said earlier, the lack of morals and the increase in freedom of decision and promiscuity, talking about sex earlier. So I think it all kind of ties in to, you're right, Rory, the individuals represented in the book also represent individuals that you can find in the society that the book is written in. So we don't really want to go on for too long, so we can make this fit into a presentation in class. But I hope this kind of gives a good idea to you guys, the audience, about new historicism and its application in a couple of different texts, and you can kind of apply this to other texts too if you're looking to find more out about new historicism. So thanks for listening, and that's all we got. Thank you.